When I think of mixing, the first thing that comes to my mind is making sure that the individual audio source has its own space and identity. And if it doesn't have its own space, it needs to work in conjunction with another source. But how do we ensure that these things work together? Balance comes to mind, but even when you have properly balanced audio, you can have sources that clash with each other. More than likely, you're dealing with frequency masking, and this is the #1 offender in making sure that your instruments will not be heard clearly. But to fix a problem that you have, first you need to be able to diagnose the problem and then be able to identify it. By the end of this episode, you'll be one step closer to solving all of your problems when it comes to masked frequencies. So what's happening, fam? Miami here with JST, and that stands for just subscribe today. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and hit the like if you love this content. Transition game, still crazy. But another crazy thing is to think about the concept of frequency masking scientifically. The laws of physics say that two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. However, sound waves are not objects. So what does this mean? Can we assume that two sounds can be in the same space and our brain decides which of these we hear based on another factor? Let's get into this. People said they miss nerdy Miami, so I'm temporarily back. But that's not the only thing that's temporary. #1. Temporal masking and frequency masking. Let's establish this first of all. Frequency masking is when multiple audio sources are playing at the same time in the same frequency range, but one is being smothered by another. This happens in a bunch of familiar places like guitars and vocals, kick and bass, cymbals and synths, etc. Even if the balance is correct, a psychoacoustic phenomenon makes you hear one over the other. And this is because these waves can exist in the same space at the same frequency at the same time. But the shape of the wave, harmonics, and timbre determine the variances that make us pick one over the other. So we have to go into a term called superposition. That means not only do the two sounds exist simultaneously, they compound on each other. And based on familiarity, your brain determines which sound it's going to listen for. EQ is going to have to be used to trick your brain into hearing the source you want to be heard most in the track.
My heart's bleeding on the shelf and the damage has been done. I hope you had your fun. I hope you had your fun. My heart's bleeding on the shelf and the damage has been done. I hope you had your fun. I hope you had your fun. My heart's bleeding on the shelf and the damage has been done. I hope you had your fun. I hope you had your fun. My heart's bleeding on the shelf and the damage has been done. I hope you had your fun. I hope you had your fun.
So temporal masking. That's the effect when a sound is so loud that you temporarily cannot hear the following sound because your brain can't process the information fast enough, or you can't even hear it fast enough. In our line of work, that would refer to transient dependent sources like drum shells, perks, production effects, etc. If you hear a big snare bomb in a track, you're most likely not even gonna notice what follows immediately after. Or even a bass note following a sub drop. I personally cannot afford a sub drop, so make sure that you hit that sub button immediately. Transition game leveled up. But yeah, no amount of EQ is really going to save you here. You're going to have to use sidechain compression with the proper attack and release to make sure you're going to hear the following sound source immediately, giving it its own identity in a mix.
So the first thing that we're going to do is pull up Wave C6. And a tip for Reaper users, you can grab the routing button here from the sub drop, drag and drop it onto here, and it is now automatically routing here and will engage the sidechain. Now let's listen to it with this preset that I made specifically for the video.
#2, identifying masking frequencies. Y'all missed the segues? I brought them back just for you. But now that you know what they are and have an understanding of how they exist in the same space, you need to be able to identify them. This is one of those moments when a smartass is probably gonna say, use your ears. But maybe you've already used your ears. Maybe your brain is playing tricks on you. So one way to go about this is to check the main areas that you know will be fighting in your song. I go over this in depth in my episode Frequencies Fighting in Your Mix and How to Combat It, but I'll just mention some here to always check for. Sub kick, bass drops, and effects rumbles for sub territory. Bass and kick drum for low end. Guitar, vocals, and keys for mid-range. cymbals and synths, vocals for presence, and it's pretty simple to find the fundamental area these are all living in when you pull up a frequency spectrum analyzer. A free one is Voxengo Span, but I prefer to use the one from FabFilter. Once you've identified the area both instruments are living in that are competing to be heard, you can either EQ or use something like track spacers, to make sure what you want heard is the most audible source. The next subject that we're going to get into regarding frequency masking is number 3, arrangement. I come from a metal and rock background, but I've been working on a lot of pop and hip hop stuff lately, and I like to translate a lot of the mixing philosophies to what we do in extremely dense mixes. Every source in hip hop and metal is meant to be large and super in your face, with layer upon layer to make a song thicker. Double track guitars, triple tracked vocals, split bass with each having its own purpose. It actually makes a lot of sense that for a long time in metal, and even now, singers have had very high vocal ranges because it keeps them out of the way of layered, distorted guitars. Because think about it, if you have a tripled vocal with 2 guitars, all in the same note range, you'll have a ton of superpositioning. So what I've been doing is layering my vocals with multiple octaves and harmonies to avoid cluttering a frequency area too much. If some of the main determining factors of what your brain decides to hear in the same frequency range are harmonics and overtones, just make some of your own to make the part stand out. This goes for guitar leads as well. Approach your art in a scientific way. If there's a pocket in the frequency spectrum and it just so happens to fit where a lower octave of your guitar would be, and the main one's not standing out, try it out and see how it fills out the track instead of double tracking or panning something. Just trying to give some food for thought over here so that your tracks will complement each other. Bringing us to number 4, complementary EQ. So if you're unfamiliar with the effect of complementary EQ, the concept is to boost a frequency on one source and to cut it on another. This works best in a mix when a track has to be there because it's the sound of the genre, but you don't necessarily want it to be at the forefront of a mix. It's an easy way to make sure that what you want to stand out stands out, and of course is common with kick and bass. Usually boosting the kick because it's such quick transient information and the bass is going to be heard right after regardless. Of course you get a tiny bit of temporal masking regardless, which is why certain people opt to do side chaining instead of EQ, but if it's anything other than metal or EDM, I'd probably just go for complementary EQ so I know what sound I'm going to have during the entire track instead of just that split second. So let's go over all of these one more time. Temporal masking and frequency masking, identifying masking frequencies, song arrangement, and complementary EQ. Understanding the way that a sound source works is the first step. Next is being able to identify it, fix it, and even complement it with the way that the song is put together. And you might even find a time when you need to remove something altogether for the betterment of the song. I know how much you guys love getting a bit deeper into these topics, which is why I wanted to expand on my original thoughts of frequencies fighting in a mix. Are there any things that you guys do to unmask frequencies? Some tips and tricks you have for the rest of the world to share? Leave it in the comments below and I'll make sure to give you my thoughts as soon as I can. If you're an engineer on the come up, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, you only have to do it one time. And tap that bell for notifications so when a video drops, you know the location. Until next time, I am out of here. Mic drop. Except as engineers we know, I'd never really drop this thing because that get really expensive, even if it is a piece of shirt. Later.